My Lyft driver switched to Spanish with his other passenger, and I understood their plan to rob my house after dropping me off. Luis was describing my home security system in detail to the woman in the front seat, explaining that he'd picked me up from this same address a week ago when I'd left for my Chicago business trip. He'd noticed I lived alone based on the single set of keys, had watched me set the alarm code through his rearview mirror, and had seen expensive electronics visible through the windows when I'd opened the door. The woman, whose name was apparently Claudia, asked how much time they'd have before I got suspicious. Luis said at least an hour after drop-off, maybe 2 if they were fast, because I'd mentioned being exhausted and wanting to sleep immediately when I got home. They were coordinating this robbery in Spanish 3 feet from me, assuming the white woman in the back seat scrolling her phone couldn't understand a word. My mother was from Guadalajara and had refused to speak English at home my entire childhood. I was completely fluent but looked Anglo enough that nobody ever guessed. I kept my expression neutral and my eyes on my phone screen while my heart hammered against my ribs. Claudia asked about valuables and Luis ticked off a list based on what he'd observed during my airport ride a week ago. Laptop, tablet, expensive camera equipment he'd helped me load into his trunk, a large flat-screen TV visible through the living room window, probably jewelry in the bedroom. He said the house was in a quiet neighborhood with limited street traffic at night, perfect for a quick in-and-out burglary. Claudia asked about neighbors, and Luis said the house on the left had been dark both times he'd driven past, possibly empty or people who slept early. The house on the right had an elderly couple he'd seen through windows, unlikely to notice or intervene. They were planning this with the efficiency of people who'd done it before, casually discussing my home like it was a business opportunity that had fallen into their lap. I wanted to shout at them, to let them know I understood every word, but some instinct told me to stay quiet and gather information. If I revealed I spoke Spanish now, they might panic or change their plan or do something desperate. Luis merged off the highway onto the exit that led to my neighborhood. We were maybe 10 minutes from my house. Claudia was asking logistical questions about entry points, and Luis said the back door had a cheap lock he could probably pick or force without much noise. He'd noticed it during the previous pickup when he'd helped me with my luggage through the side gate to get to my car in the garage. He'd been casing my house for a week, gathering intelligence while playing the friendly, helpful driver. The woman asked about police response time in this area, and Luis said at least 15 minutes based on crime reports he'd checked online, plenty of time to grab valuables and disappear. They were discussing my home invasion with the detached professionalism of contractors planning a job. My hands were shaking slightly as I typed a text to my neighbor David, trying to look casual while crafting an SOS message that wouldn't alert Luis if he glanced in the rearview mirror. David was retired FBI, paranoid about neighborhood security, the kind of guy who still carried a weapon when he checked his mailbox. I texted David, "Coming home now. If you see anyone at my house in the next 2 hours, call police immediately. We'll explain later." David was the perfect person to contact because he'd been warning the neighborhood about property crime for years, had organized watch groups and security assessments. His response came back within 30 seconds. "Roger that. Everything okay?" I typed back, "We'll explain when I'm safely inside. Just watch my place, please." Luis turned onto my street and I felt my stomach clench. Claudia was reviewing their timeline out loud in Spanish. Luis drops me off, confirms I go inside and lock up, then he drops Claudia at her apartment complex a few blocks away. They wait 30 minutes to make sure I'm asleep, then Claudia walks back to my house while Luis parks his car somewhere less visible. They break in through the back door, grab everything valuable they can carry in under 10 minutes, meet at the car, and drive away. Luis would cancel his Lyft activity for the night, claim car trouble if anyone asked questions later. It was straightforward and simple, and they'd clearly planned this quickly after Luis realized I was requesting another airport ride from the same address. We pulled up in front of my house, and Luis put the car in park. He turned around with a friendly smile and said in heavily accented English, "Here you are, miss. Have a good night." I forced myself to smile back and thank him, pulling my carry-on from the back seat. Every movement felt performed, theatrical, as I walked up my front path and unlocked my door. I could feel Luis watching me from the car, probably noting which lights I turned on, which direction I walked once inside, building a mental map of my movements and routines. I stepped inside, closed the door, and immediately looked through the peephole. Luis was still parked outside, his phone to his ear, probably confirming to Claudia that I'd gone inside. He watched my house for another full minute, his face visible in the streetlight, before pulling away to complete the charade of dropping Claudia off. I had maybe 40 minutes before they returned to rob me. I needed to call the police, but I also needed evidence that would actually get them arrested and convicted. My word against theirs wouldn't be enough, and they could claim I'd misunderstood Spanish or fabricated the conversation. I pulled out my phone and realized I'd recorded the entire Lyft ride. I always recorded ride shares for safety after a friend had been assaulted by a driver last year, just audio running in my pocket the whole trip. The habit had started as paranoia but now seemed prescient. I played it back and heard Luis and Claudia's conversation in crystal clear Spanish, every detail of their robbery plan captured with timestamps and metadata that would prove authenticity. It was admissible evidence, but only if I could get police here to catch them in the act. A recording of a planned crime wasn't the same as catching them committing it. I called 911 and explained the situation to a dispatcher who sounded skeptical at first. I told her I had audio recording of my Lyft driver and his accomplice planning to rob my house within the next hour, that they were counting on me being asleep and unaware. She said she'd send officers but asked me to stay on the line and not confront anyone. I explained I needed to set up my own security cameras to capture the break-in attempt, that I wanted them caught in the act with undeniable evidence. The dispatcher tried to talk me out of it, said it was too dangerous, that I should leave my house and wait for police at a neighbor's home. But I was already moving through my house, positioning my phone and laptop to record the back door and living room. I set my phone on the kitchen counter with a clear view of the back entrance, started a video recording app that would capture everything. My laptop went on the bookshelf in the living room, angled to show the front door and the electronics Luis had mentioned stealing. I killed most of the lights in my house and turned on the TV in my bedroom, making it look like I'd gone to bed watching something before falling asleep. The dispatcher was still on the line asking what I was doing, and I explained I was setting up documentation while making the house look occupied but vulnerable. She connected me to a sergeant who took over the call and asked more pointed questions about the recording, about what exactly Luis and Claudia had said, about whether I'd felt threatened during the ride. I explained I'd maintained composure specifically to avoid alerting them, that revealing I understood Spanish would have escalated the situation unpredictably. The sergeant said he was sending multiple units to my address and coordinating with detectives, but I needed to evacuate immediately. I grabbed my car keys and wallet and slipped out my front door, walking quickly down the street to David's house 3 doors down. My legs felt unsteady and I kept looking over my shoulder expecting to see Luis's car returning early. David opened before I could knock, his face concerned, and I saw he was wearing a shoulder holster with his service weapon visible. He'd taken my text seriously enough to arm himself. I gave him the abbreviated version. Lyft driver planned to rob me. I had it recorded. Police were coming. I needed somewhere to watch from safely. David's expression hardened, and he let me inside, leading me to his home office where he had his own security camera system monitoring his property and clear sightlines to my house. He pulled up his cameras and added a view showing my front door and driveway. His system was professional grade, the kind of setup only someone with federal law enforcement background would maintain in retirement. We sat in the dark watching monitors while I played him the recording of Luis and Claudia's Spanish conversation. David listened with the intense focus of someone trained to analyze threats, and when it finished, he made a phone call to someone he identified only as Frank from the Bureau. David explained the situation in terse official language, using law enforcement terminology I barely understood. He was calling in favors, activating networks of former colleagues who could coordinate a response faster than standard police procedures. Frank apparently had contacts in local law enforcement and could ensure this wasn't treated as a routine burglary call, but as an organized crime investigation. David hung up and told me Frank was making calls, that we'd have serious police presence within 20 minutes, that they'd wait for Luis and Claudia to actually enter my house before making arrests to ensure charges would stick. He asked me detailed questions about the recording, about whether I'd edited it or manipulated it in any way, explaining that defense attorneys would attack its authenticity if there was any possibility of tampering. I assured him it was a continuous unedited recording pulled directly from my phone's app with intact metadata. David nodded and said that was good, that metadata would establish chain of evidence, that this case was prosecutable if we handled it correctly. His calm professional demeanor helped steady my nerves, made this feel manageable rather than overwhelming. 32 minutes after Luis had dropped me off, his car appeared at the end of my street, parking 4 houses down with the lights off. I watched through David's camera system as Luis climbed out and looked around carefully before walking toward my house, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this before. 2 minutes later, Claudia appeared from the other direction, walking along the sidewalk with her hands in her jacket pockets, probably carrying tools or bags for the stolen goods. They met at my side gate and Luis pulled out lockpicking tools from his jacket, working on the gate lock while Claudia stood watch. The whole thing took less than 40 seconds before they disappeared into my backyard heading toward the back door. David was on his phone with Frank, narrating their movements, and I could hear him coordinating with someone about police positioning. Multiple units were apparently staged nearby waiting for the signal that Luis and Claudia had actually entered my house, ensuring the charges would be breaking and entering rather than just trespassing or attempted burglary. I watched my own cameras showing the back door through David's monitor system. Luis appeared on camera picking the lock with practiced efficiency, his movements smooth and unhurried. The door swung open and both of them entered my house, moving quickly through my kitchen toward the living room where my electronics were visible. Luis went straight for my laptop while Claudia grabbed the TV, unplugging it with movements that suggested this wasn't her first burglary. They were communicating in Spanish about what to grab next, discussing my camera equipment and whether it would fit in the bags they'd brought. Claudia mentioned checking the bedroom for jewelry while Luis said to be fast, that they had maybe 10 minutes before risk increased. They'd been inside my house for 3 minutes when police cars appeared on the street, 4 of them converging simultaneously with lights off until they were in position. David said Frank had coordinated it, called in some favors to ensure serious response rather than a single patrol unit that might let suspects flee or destroy evidence. The police surrounded my house front and back before turning on their lights and sirens simultaneously. The effect was dramatic, sudden illumination and sound that made Luis and Claudia freeze on camera. I watched through multiple camera angles as they realized they were trapped, dropping the electronics and looking for escape routes that didn't exist. Luis tried to run toward the front door and was tackled by 2 officers in my entryway, his face slamming into my hardwood floor with a sound I could hear through David's audio system. Claudia attempted the back door and ran straight into 3 more officers with weapons drawn, shouting commands in English and Spanish. She dropped to her knees immediately, crying and putting her hands behind her head. The whole arrest took less than 3 minutes from the first police car arriving to both suspects in handcuffs. David and I walked over to my house where a sergeant was reading Luis and Claudia their rights in English, then Spanish when they claimed not to understand. The sergeant's Spanish was clunky and heavily accented, and I watched Luis's face as he realized the sergeant was struggling through memorized phrases rather than speaking fluently. I identified myself as the homeowner and played the sergeant the recording of their Spanish conversation planning the robbery. His expression darkened as he listened to Luis describing my security system, and Claudia asking about valuables. He asked me how I'd obtained the recording, and I explained the rideshare audio recording I kept for safety, completely legal in our single-party consent state. Luis and Claudia were both staring at me with confusion and growing rage, clearly trying to understand how their perfect plan had failed. Luis started shouting in Spanish that I'd lied to them, that I'd pretended not to understand, that this was entrapment. I responded in fluent Spanish, explaining that I'd never claimed not to speak Spanish. I'd simply stayed quiet while he and Claudia assumed I didn't understand. The sergeant asked if I spoke Spanish, and I confirmed I was raised bilingual by my Mexican mother. Luis started screaming that I'd entrapped them, that I'd deliberately hidden my language ability to trick them. The sergeant cut him off in English, explaining that speaking Spanish in front of someone who happened to understand it wasn't entrapment, it was stupidity. They'd planned a felony crime and executed it while being recorded, and now they'd be charged with burglary, conspiracy, and potentially organized crime if this was part of a pattern. Detectives arrived within the hour and the scene transformed into a full crime scene investigation. They photographed everything, collected the electronics Luis and Claudia had tried to steal, processed my house for fingerprints and evidence. One detective, Lieutenant Angela Ruiz, took my statement while another team searched Luis's car parked down the street. I walked her through the entire evening from ordering the shared ride to overhearing the Spanish conversation to recording it all and setting up the trap with David's help. Lieutenant Ruiz was thorough and precise, asking questions that anticipated defense attorney objections. She wanted to verify I hadn't somehow manipulated or edited the recording, that the timestamps were authentic, that I could testify to its accuracy under oath. I assured her everything was genuine and unedited, pulled directly from my phone's recording app with intact metadata, showing continuous recording from pickup to drop-off. Lieutenant Ruiz played the audio for Luis and Claudia separately in patrol cars, asking them to confirm it was their voices. Luis refused to answer without a lawyer, but his silence was telling. Claudia broke down crying and admitted everything, saying Luis had convinced her this would be easy money, that he'd done it before and never been caught, that they'd split the proceeds from selling my electronics and jewelry. The police searched Luis's car and found lock-picking tools, gloves, a flashlight with red filter for night work, and a detailed notebook with addresses and notes about homes he'd driven to for Lyft rides. The notebook was damning, page after page of addresses with dates, times, notes about security systems, sketches of property layouts, and estimated values of items he'd seen. My address was listed with entry dated 1 week ago, notes matching everything Luis had described to Claudia in Spanish. Notes about my alarm code, about living alone, about expensive camera equipment, about the elderly couple next door. The sergeant called for detectives and told me this was significantly bigger than a single attempted robbery. Luis had been using his Lyft driver position to case houses for months, possibly longer, gathering intelligence about when people traveled and what valuables they owned. He'd built a sophisticated operation using the trust inherent in rideshare services to gain access to people's homes and routines. Other addresses in the notebook matched unsolved burglaries in the area over the past 6 months, houses that had been robbed while homeowners were out of town or away for work. The detective team started making calls to those addresses, waking up homeowners to ask about past burglaries and whether they'd used Lyft services. Lieutenant Ruiz asked me to come to the station the next morning to give a formal recorded statement. She explained this case was going to be bigger than anyone initially realized, that my recording and the notebook suggested an organized criminal enterprise rather than opportunistic burglary. She wanted everything documented properly for federal prosecution if it came to that. I agreed and spent the rest of the night at David's house, too wired to sleep, watching the crime scene techs work through windows. David made coffee and we sat in his kitchen talking about the investigation. He explained that organized burglary rings often used legitimate businesses as cover, that taxi and rideshare drivers were ideal positions for reconnaissance because they had natural reasons to visit residential areas and observe homes. He'd worked cases years ago involving delivery drivers and utility workers who'd cased homes for burglary crews. This pattern with Luis fit established criminal methodologies. David thought the notebook suggested Luis had been operating for at least a year, maybe longer, and probably had accomplices beyond Claudia. No one person could execute that many burglaries alone, especially if they were maintaining a Lyft driving schedule as cover. The morning news covered the arrest with helicopter footage of my house and the police presence. The local station described it as a rideshare driver accused of casing homes for burglary. arrested during an attempted break-in. They didn't name me as the victim, but showed my address clearly, which I found disturbing. My phone started ringing with calls from reporters asking for interviews. I declined them all on Lieutenant Ruiz's advice, who said media coverage could complicate prosecution if I said something that defense attorneys could use. David fielded calls at his house and told reporters I had no comment pending the investigation. The story picked up traction because it touched on fears people had about rideshare safety, about trusting strangers with knowledge of their homes and routines. The local Lyft office was forced to issue a statement about driver vetting and safety protocols, but the statement felt hollow given that Luis had been operating under their platform for months while burglarizing passengers. At the police station, I gave a 3-hour recorded statement covering everything I could remember. Lieutenant Ruiz asked detailed questions about Luis's behavior during both rides, about whether he'd asked suspicious questions or shown unusual interest in my home. I explained he'd seemed completely normal and professional during the first ride to the airport, helpful with luggage, friendly small talk about travel, nothing that raised red flags. That was the disturbing part. Luis had been skilled at appearing trustworthy while gathering intelligence for crimes. The second ride had been equally normal until the phone call, until he'd switched to Spanish and revealed his true intentions. Lieutenant Ruiz said this pattern was common with confidence criminals who used positions of trust to exploit victims. She showed me photos of items recovered from Luis's car and asked if I recognized any of them. Several pieces of jewelry looked familiar from neighbors' homes, and I realized Luis might have burglarized multiple houses on my street while I'd been unaware. The scope of his operation was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence. The interrogation of Claudia revealed extensive details about Luis's criminal network. She claimed Luis had recruited her 3 months ago, when she'd been a passenger in his Lyft, had learned she was struggling financially with medical bills for her daughter's cancer treatment, and had offered her easy money for helping with burglaries. She described how Luis would identify targets during his Lyft shifts, gather intelligence about security systems and valuables, then coordinate with accomplices to execute burglaries when homeowners were away. Claudia had helped with 3 previous robberies, serving as lookout and helping carry stolen goods. She claimed Luis had manipulated her into participating, promised her money she desperately needed, but Lieutenant Ruiz said Claudia was still facing serious felony charges as an accomplice. The interrogation revealed names of 2 other people Luis had recruited, both former passengers who'd become accomplices. Police arrested them within 24 hours based on Claudia's cooperation and evidence in Luis's notebook. The burglary ring was larger than anyone had initially suspected, with at least 5 active participants and possibly more. The other addresses in Luis's notebook were sent to detectives working unsolved burglary cases throughout the region. Within 2 days, they'd connected Luis to 8 confirmed burglaries based on timeline matches, Lyft ride records, and stolen property recovery. Luis's Lyft account history showed he'd driven all 8 victims to or from the airport in the weeks before their homes were robbed, establishing clear pattern and opportunity. Police obtained search warrants for storage units rented under Luis's name and under the names of his accomplices. They found units filled with electronics, jewelry, artwork, and other items stolen from homes over the past 8 months. The sheer volume was staggering, suggesting Luis had been running a sophisticated fencing operation in addition to the burglaries. Victims were contacted and asked to identify their property, and the recovery rate was unusually high because Luis had been stockpiling items to fence through online marketplaces, rather than selling them immediately to pawn shops where they might be traced. One storage unit contained over $200,000 in stolen goods, carefully cataloged with notes about estimated resale value and potential buyers. The case made local news and then national headlines when the full scope emerged. Rideshare driver uses job to target homes for burglary. Passengers unknowingly cased during airport rides. Network of accomplices recruited through the app. The story went viral because it touched on widespread fears about the gig economy and trusting strangers with access to personal information. Passengers started questioning whether their drivers were trustworthy, whether they were being cased every time they requested rides to or from airports. Lyft immediately deactivated Luis's account and released statements about background checks and safety protocols, but the damage to their reputation was severe. The company faced questions about why their systems hadn't flagged Luis's pattern of driving to the same addresses multiple times, about whether background checks were adequate, about what liability they bore for crimes committed by drivers using their platform. Legal experts on news programs debated corporate responsibility and the limitations of background check systems that might not catch criminals who'd never been convicted. Lyft faced lawsuits from victims whose homes had been robbed, claiming the company should have caught Luis's pattern earlier or implemented better security measures. Class action attorneys started organizing victims into a lawsuit alleging negligent vetting and inadequate monitoring of driver behavior. I was contacted by several law firms asking if I wanted to join the lawsuit, and I agreed after consulting with an attorney who explained Lyft bore some responsibility for providing Luis access to victims through their platform. The company initially fought the lawsuits aggressively, claiming drivers were independent contractors, and the company couldn't be held liable for criminal acts committed off-platform. But discovery revealed internal communications, showing Lyft had been warned about potential security vulnerabilities in their system and had chosen not to implement additional monitoring due to cost concerns. Those communications destroyed their defense and forced settlement negotiations. The company eventually settled the class action for an undisclosed amount reported to be in the tens of millions, with individual payouts to victims based on losses suffered. My own settlement included compensation for the trauma and risk I'd experienced, acknowledgement that their driver had targeted me through their platform. My case became the primary evidence in Luis and Claudia's criminal prosecution because I'd recorded their planning conversation and then caught them in the act with police coordination. The district attorney, a woman named Rebecca Thornton, built her entire case around my audio recording and the notebook found in Luis's car. She filed charges against Luis, including 11 counts of burglary, conspiracy, organized crime enterprise, attempted burglary for my house, and fraud for lying to Lyft about his background during the driver application process. Claudia faced 8 counts including burglary, conspiracy, and accessory charges. The other accomplices received varying charges based on their level of involvement. The prosecution's strategy was to establish Luis as the ringleader of a criminal enterprise who'd weaponized the trust inherent in rideshare services to prey on vulnerable passengers. DA Thornton explained to me that my recording was crucial because it showed premeditation and planning, proved Luis wasn't acting opportunistically, but was running a sophisticated operation. The recording would be played for the jury to demonstrate the cold calculation behind Luis's crimes. The trial was scheduled for 9 months later after both Luis and Claudia were denied bail. The judge ruled they were flight risks given the serious charges and evidence of criminal sophistication. Luis's public defender, an overworked attorney named Marcus Delgado, tried multiple pretrial motions to suppress evidence. He argued the recording violated wiretapping laws, claiming I'd recorded private conversations without consent. DA Thornton countered that I'd recorded my own rideshare ride for personal safety, completely legal under state single-party consent laws that allowed recording of conversations you're participating in. The judge agreed and denied the motion. Delgado then argued I'd entrapped Luis by hiding my Spanish fluency, claiming Luis wouldn't have planned the robbery if he'd known I understood. The prosecution explained that speaking a language openly while others listened wasn't entrapment, that Luis had no reasonable expectation of privacy regarding conversations conducted in a shared vehicle with passengers present. Judge Thomas Brennan rejected this argument as well, noting dryly that criminals don't get to claim entrapment because they assumed victims wouldn't understand them. The defense motions failed comprehensively, setting up a trial where the evidence against Luis was overwhelming. Jury selection took 3 days, with both sides questioning potential jurors about their experiences with rideshare services and their ability to be impartial about immigrant defendants. Luis's attorney tried to strike jurors who admitted to feeling unsafe in rideshares, but DA Thornton argued that was precisely the crime's impact and couldn't be grounds for exclusion. The final jury included 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from mid-20s to late 60s, representing diverse backgrounds and experiences. The trial itself lasted 2 weeks and was covered extensively by local media. I testified on the second day, walking the jury through ordering the shared ride, overhearing the Spanish conversation, recording it, and coordinating with police to catch Luis in the act. The defense tried to paint me as someone who'd overreacted to an innocent conversation, suggesting I'd misunderstood colloquial Spanish or misinterpreted harmless comments. DA Thornton played the full audio recording in court with a certified translator providing English transcript. The jury heard Luis and Claudia discussing my alarm code, my valuables, the best entry point, and their timeline for the burglary. The defense attorney's cross-examination felt desperate, focused on minor inconsistencies in my timeline, rather than addressing the clear content of the recording. Claudia testified against Luis as part of her plea agreement, describing in detail how he'd recruited her and coordinated multiple burglaries. She explained Luis's methods, identifying targets during airport rides, noting travel schedules and home security, maintaining detailed records in his notebook, recruiting accomplices from his passenger pool by identifying people in financial distress. She testified that Luis had told her he'd been doing this for over a year, that he'd successfully robbed dozens of homes, that he'd only been caught because I'd understood Spanish and set a trap. Her testimony was damaging and comprehensive, painting Luis as a criminal mastermind who'd exploited the gig economy for sophisticated organized crime. The defense tried to discredit her as a co-conspirator making things up for a plea deal, but her testimony matched the physical evidence too perfectly. The notebook, the storage units, the Lyft records, all of it corroborated her account of Luis's operation. The prosecution presented testimony from 11 other victims whose homes Luis had robbed, people who described the violation and trauma of returning from trips to find their homes burglarized. One woman, Jennifer Kowalski, testified about returning from her father's funeral to find her house ransacked, family heirlooms stolen, the trauma compounded by grief. She'd used Lyft to get to the airport for that funeral trip, and records showed Luis had been her driver. Another victim, David Chang, described losing his late wife's jewelry collection, items that couldn't be replaced because of their sentimental value. He identified pieces recovered from Luis's storage unit, breaking down on the stand as he held his wife's wedding ring that he'd thought was gone forever. The victim's testimony was powerful and emotional, demonstrating that Luis hadn't just stolen objects but had violated people's sense of security and taken irreplaceable connections to loved ones and memories. The jury watched these testimonies with visible emotion, several jurors wiping tears as victims described their losses. The defense presented character witnesses claiming Luis was a hardworking immigrant trying to support his family, but it rang hollow against the weight of evidence. Luis's own sister testified that he'd always been entrepreneurial and resourceful, seeming not to realize this description actually supported the prosecution's narrative of calculated criminal enterprise. The defense's case lasted less than 2 days compared to the prosecution's 10 days of evidence and testimony. In closing arguments, DA Thornton summarized the case with devastating clarity. She described how Luis had weaponized trust, using his position as a rideshare driver to prey on vulnerable passengers during travel. She played portions of my recording again, reminding the jury of Luis's cold planning and Claudia's questions about how much time they'd have to rob my house. She walked through the 11 confirmed burglaries, the 20-plus addresses in the notebook, the storage units filled with stolen property. She ended by asking the jury to send a message that criminals couldn't exploit the gig economy to victimize hardworking people who'd done nothing wrong except trust a driver to get them safely home. The jury deliberated for 4 hours over 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Luis's face remained impassive as the verdicts were read, but I saw his hands clenching the table in front of him. Claudia, watching from the gallery where she was required to be present, put her face in her hands and cried. The victims in the courtroom reacted with relief and tears, some hugging each other, others sitting in stunned silence processing the validation of guilty verdicts. Judge Brennan thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Outside the courthouse, DA Thornton held a press conference describing the verdict as justice for victims and a warning to criminals who thought they could exploit technology and trust for criminal purposes. She praised my quick thinking and courage in recording the conversation and setting up the trap that led to Luis's arrest. Reporters asked me for comment and I kept it brief, saying I hoped this case would make people safer and that companies like Lyft would improve their security measures to prevent similar crimes. Sentencing day came on a cold morning in January. The courtroom was packed with victims, media, and observers. Judge Brennan invited victim impact statements before imposing sentence, and 6 people spoke about how Luis's crimes had affected them. Jennifer Kowalski described how she couldn't feel safe in her own home anymore, how she'd moved to a new house because returning to the burglarized one triggered panic attacks. David Chang spoke about the irreplaceable loss of his wife's jewelry and how violated he'd felt knowing someone had been in his bedroom, touching their personal belongings. One by one, victims described trauma that extended far beyond stolen property. They described changed locks that didn't make them feel secure, security systems that couldn't eliminate the knowledge that someone had violated their space, therapy to process the trauma. Judge Brennan listened without interruption, his expression grave. When the victims finished, he addressed Luis directly, describing how Luis had violated the basic trust between service providers and customers, had weaponized access to people's homes and schedules, had shown no remorse throughout the investigation or trial. He called Luis's crimes calculated and predatory, noted the sophisticated planning and organization, observed that Luis had recruited accomplices and built a criminal enterprise that had operated for over a year. Judge Brennan sentenced Luis to 28 years in federal prison with no parole eligibility for at least 15 years. The sentence exceeded prosecution recommendations, but the judge explained that the scope of Luis's crimes and the number of victims justified an enhanced sentence. Luis would serve his sentence in a federal facility far from his family, and upon release would face deportation proceedings to return him to Mexico. Claudia, sentenced separately the following week, received 8 years with parole eligibility after 4, contingent on her continued cooperation identifying other potential accomplices and helping recover additional stolen property. The 3 other people Luis had recruited for various burglaries received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. Restitution orders totaled over $400,000 between all defendants, though victims would likely never see full repayment given the defendants' financial situations. The civil lawsuits against Lyft continued for another year before settling in the class action for reported payments totaling $43 million, distributed among 87 victims who'd been burglarized by Luis or his accomplices. The aftermath of the trial and sentencing lasted for months. I participated in multiple follow-up investigations as police in neighboring jurisdictions identified additional burglaries that might be connected to Luis's network. My recording was used as training material for law enforcement about how criminals exploit new technologies and trust relationships. I was invited to speak at a law enforcement conference about rideshare security and passenger awareness, and while public speaking terrified me, I felt obligated to share what I'd learned. My presentation focused on the power imbalance inherent in rideshare situations, how drivers had extensive access to personal information that could be weaponized, and how passengers needed to be aware of potential risks. I discussed the false sense of security created by star ratings and corporate branding, explaining how people trusted drivers because an app said they were safe without understanding the limited nature of background checks and monitoring systems. The audience of police officers and security professionals asked pointed questions about red flags and prevention strategies, and I shared everything I'd learned from my experience. 6 months after sentencing, I testified at a state legislative hearing about rideshare safety and passenger protections. Lawmakers were drafting bills to require additional background checks for drivers, implement monitoring systems for suspicious patterns, and create passenger protections against being targeted by drivers with access to personal information. My testimony focused on how Luis had exploited Lyft's platform to case homes, how the company's monitoring systems had failed to catch patterns that should have been obvious, and how passengers deserved better protection from companies operating in the transportation space. I explained that Luis had driven to my address twice within a week, that his notebook contained dozens of addresses he'd visited multiple times, that these patterns should have triggered security reviews if proper systems existed. I recommended legislation requiring companies to monitor for drivers repeatedly visiting the same locations, to implement red flag systems for suspicious behavior, and to face significant penalties for negligent security practices. The Legislative Committee asked detailed questions about what protections would have helped prevent my situation, and I worked with them to draft language that balanced driver privacy with passenger safety. The legislation passed with bipartisan support 4 months later and became a model for other states implementing similar protections. The bill required rideshare companies operating in the state to implement monitoring systems that would flag drivers who showed suspicious patterns like repeatedly requesting rides from specific neighborhoods or driving to the same addresses multiple times within short time periods. Companies were required to investigate flagged drivers and report findings to state authorities. The bill also strengthened background check requirements and created liability frameworks that made companies responsible for negligent security practices that enabled driver misconduct. Lyft and Uber both opposed the legislation initially, claiming it was overly burdensome and would increase costs for riders, but public support was overwhelming after the media coverage of Luis's case. The companies eventually stopped fighting and began implementing the required security measures. Other states studied the legislation and passed similar bills, creating a national push for stronger rideshare security that might never have happened without Luis's arrest and the publicity around my case. David, my retired FBI neighbor, became a local advocate for community security after the incident. The experience of coordinating the trap and working with police had reactivated something in him that retirement had suppressed. He installed camera systems for several neighbors at cost, organized a neighborhood watch program, and ran training sessions on residential security and recognizing suspicious activity. He said catching Luis's robbery attempt had given him purpose after years of retirement boredom, but I could tell it was more than that. David had spent his career fighting organized crime, and the Luis case had reminded him why that work mattered. We became close friends, bonded by that night of watching monitors and coordinating with police, and I valued his perspective on security and threat assessment. He'd saved my possessions and possibly my life by helping me avoid being home when Luis broke in, because there was no guarantee Luis wouldn't have hurt me if I'd been asleep and woken up during the robbery. Some of the victims Luis had burglarized reported signs that he'd been in their homes while they slept, that he'd been comfortable enough in his criminal methodology to take risks that more cautious burglars would avoid. My mother called from Guadalajara after seeing the national news coverage. She was crying and thanking God I was safe, but also expressing pride that my Spanish fluency had saved me and helped catch a criminal. She said she'd insisted I speak Spanish growing up despite my father's objections, precisely because you never knew when language skills would matter, when cultural connection would provide advantages or protection. She'd been right in ways she never could have predicted. I told her the story became national news specifically because I'd understood Spanish when Luis assumed I didn't, that the case had changed rideshare regulations and helped protect other passengers from similar crimes. She laughed through tears, saying this was exactly why maintaining language across generations saved lives, why assimilation shouldn't mean abandoning the tools your parents gave you. I'd spent years downplaying my bilingual abilities in professional settings, worried it would pigeonhole me or create assumptions about my background and capabilities. Corporate America preferred employees who looked and sounded generically professional, and my Anglo appearance meant I could pass as monolingual without anyone questioning it. But now I was grateful I'd maintained fluency, even when it wasn't immediately useful in my career. The story of my case reached other victims who'd been burglarized but never connected it to rideshare services. A woman in Philadelphia contacted me through my attorney after reading news coverage, explaining that her house had been robbed 3 years ago after she'd used Lyft to get to the airport for a family vacation. She'd never suspected the driver might be connected, had assumed it was random bad luck. Now she was reopening her police case with new information about the driver's identity, and investigators were checking if that driver had a similar pattern to Luis. Cases in California, Texas, and Florida surfaced with similar circumstances. Victims robbed after using rideshares, homes targeted when people were traveling, some evidence suggesting drivers had cased the properties. My attorney forwarded these contacts to DA Thornton and Lieutenant Ruiz, who coordinated with law enforcement in other jurisdictions to investigate potential networks beyond Luis's operation. The emerging evidence suggested that rideshare-based burglary might be more widespread than anyone had realized, that criminals across the country had recognized the same exploitation opportunity Luis had discovered. The recovery of stolen property from Luis's storage units resulted in dozens of victims getting back items they'd thought were lost forever. The police held identification sessions where victims could view recovered items and claim what belonged to them. I attended one of these sessions to support other victims and watched people break down crying as they found wedding rings, family heirlooms, computers containing irreplaceable photos and documents, electronics that represented major financial losses for people who couldn't easily afford replacements. The victim's relief was profound, and many contacted me directly to thank me for recording that conversation and helping catch Luis before he could rob more homes and cause more pain. One woman whose engagement ring had been stolen wrote me a detailed letter describing how she'd been devastated by its loss, how the ring represented her fiancé who died in a car accident before they could marry, how it was her only remaining physical connection to him. Getting it back felt like recovering a piece of him, she wrote. Stories like hers made the inconvenience and stress of the investigation and trial worthwhile. Patricia Valdez, one of the victims whose house Luis had robbed while she was at her daughter's college graduation, organized a victim support group that met monthly to process the shared trauma and advocate for better security measures. She invited me to speak at the first meeting, and I attended nervously, unsure what to say to people who'd actually lost possessions and security while I'd managed to prevent the robbery of my home. But Patricia insisted my perspective was valuable, that I'd experienced the same targeting and threat even though the outcome had been different. The group included 15 people whose homes Luis had burglarized, plus several victims of other home invasions who'd heard about the group and wanted support. We met in a community center and people shared their experiences, the trauma of returning home to find their space violated, the difficulty sleeping afterward, the constant anxiety that it might happen again. Several people described moving to new homes because they couldn't feel safe in the burglarized ones, couldn't stop imagining Luis walking through their bedrooms and touching their belongings. The psychological impact extended far beyond stolen property, and the support group provided space to acknowledge that without judgment. I shared my recording with the group, and they listened to Luis and Claudia planning to rob my house. Hearing it helped some people process their own experiences, made the abstract violation feel more concrete and nameable. One victim said hearing Luis's casual tone discussing the robbery helped her understand that she wasn't personally targeted, that Luis had been treating this as business rather than personal attack. That perspective helped her stop taking the violation personally and start processing it as random crime that could have happened to anyone. The support group became a regular part of my life, meeting once a month for over a year. We advocated together for stronger security legislation, wrote letters to rideshare companies demanding better protections, and supported each other through the ongoing trauma recovery. Patricia became a friend and ally, someone who understood the specific violation of having a service provider betray trust for criminal purposes. She'd started the support group because she'd felt isolated in her trauma, unable to explain to friends and family why she couldn't move past the burglary, why stolen objects felt like stolen safety. 3 years after Luis was sentenced, I got a letter forwarded through the prison system. It was from Patricia, who was writing to tell me that the support group had successfully advocated for a statewide victim compensation fund that would provide financial assistance to burglary victims for security upgrades and therapy costs. The fund had been created through legislation we'd supported, funded by fees on rideshare companies operating in the state. Patricia said this victory felt meaningful, that turning our shared trauma into systemic change honored what we'd survived. She thanked me again for being alert enough to catch Luis and strong enough to set up the trap that got him arrested, for sharing my story publicly despite the stress and exposure, for testifying at legislative hearings when I could have just moved on with my life. She said my actions that night had rippled out in ways I might not fully realize, protecting people and recovering treasures that couldn't be replaced, changing laws and creating safer systems for passengers who'd never know about the threat we'd stopped. I keep Patricia's letter in my desk drawer and read it occasionally when I'm doubting whether the whole ordeal was worth the stress and time investment. The trial, the testimony, the media attention, the legislative hearings, all of it felt overwhelming while it was happening. I'd wanted privacy and normalcy, wanted to forget about Luis and Claudia and return to regular life. But Patricia's letter reminded me that catching Luis hadn't just been about protecting myself or getting justice for one attempted robbery. It had been about stopping someone who was systematically violating people's homes and safety, who was using his position as a trusted service provider to exploit vulnerable moments when people were traveling or away from home. The Spanish language that had been just a personal skill, something I'd maintained out of respect for my mother and connection to her culture, had become the crucial tool that exposed Luis's criminal enterprise. And that mattered more than my temporary discomfort. That changed lives and recovered irreplaceable items, and put a serial burglar behind bars for decades where he couldn't hurt anyone else. I still use rideshare services, but I'm more cautious now. I check the driver's photo against their face more carefully. I don't mention travel plans or share personal information. I've learned to pay attention to whether drivers ask suspicious questions or show unusual interest in my home. And I always record my rides, maintaining that audio documentation that saved me when Luis planned his robbery. The recording habit that started as paranoia after a friend's assault has become standard practice, shared with others who've heard my story and adopted the same precaution. Sometimes people recognize me from news coverage and ask if I'm the woman who caught the Lyft burglar. I always say yes and use it as an opportunity to share security advice. Record your rides, trust your instincts, don't assume corporate vetting protects you from all threats. The conversation usually leads to discussions about language skills and cultural connection, about how maintaining my mother's language gave me advantages I'd never expected to need. My relationship with my mother deepened after the Luis case. She'd always emphasized the importance of speaking Spanish, of maintaining connection to her culture and heritage, but I'd treated it as obligation rather than gift. Now I understood it as both. The language she'd insisted I learn had literally saved me from being victimized, had given me information Luis never intended me to have. But it had also connected me to a community of Spanish speakers who'd supported me through the investigation and trial, who'd understood the cultural dynamics at play when Luis had assumed I wouldn't understand his language. My mother's decision to refuse English at home, which had sometimes embarrassed me as a child, had equipped me with tools that proved invaluable in crisis. That's a gift worth acknowledging, worth honoring through continued practice and connection. I speak Spanish regularly now, not just with my mother, but in my community, with colleagues, with anyone who offers the opportunity. Every conversation in Spanish feels like honoring what my mother gave me, and what that gift enabled me to do. David and I still meet weekly for coffee and conversation about security, crime patterns, and community safety. He says I'm his most successful civilian rescue, the case where everything went right and nobody got hurt. But I know I was lucky. Lucky that I maintained Spanish fluency, lucky that Luis spoke openly in front of me, lucky that David lived nearby with his camera system and law enforcement connections, lucky that police took my report seriously and coordinated quickly. So many elements had to align for me to escape victimization, and for Luis to be caught. Other victims hadn't been as fortunate, hadn't overheard warning conversations, hadn't been able to set traps, hadn't recovered stolen items. My success felt somewhat arbitrary, dependent on circumstances beyond my control. But David insists it wasn't just luck. He says I made good decisions under pressure, trusted my instincts, gathered evidence rather than panicking, and coordinated effectively with people who could help. Those decisions mattered as much as the fortunate circumstances, he argues. I've learned to accept both perspectives. I was lucky and I made good choices. Both things can be true simultaneously. The rideshare industry changed significantly in the years following Luis's conviction. Companies implemented the monitoring systems required by new legislation, created security teams focused on identifying suspicious driver patterns, improved background checks, and added additional review layers for drivers with access to passenger information. Lyft and Uber both launched passenger safety initiatives, including easier reporting systems for suspicious behavior and faster response protocols for security concerns. Some of these changes were purely reactive, attempts to avoid liability and negative publicity, but some represented genuine improvements in how companies balanced driver flexibility with passenger safety. The changes weren't perfect and gaps remained, but the landscape was measurably different than it had been when Luis operated freely for over a year without detection. Industry conferences now included sessions on preventing driver misconduct and recognizing criminal exploitation of gig economy platforms. My case became a teaching example, a cautionary tale about what happens when companies prioritize growth over security and when criminals recognize systemic vulnerabilities before the companies do. 5 years after that night when Luis drove me home from the airport, I can finally talk about it without my hands shaking. The PTSD symptoms that dominated the first year, hypervigilance and anxiety and difficulty sleeping, have mostly resolved through therapy and time. I'm not the same person I was before I climbed into that lift and overheard the Spanish conversation, but I've made peace with the changes the experience forced on me. I'm more cautious about trust now, more aware of potential threats, but also more confident in my ability to handle crises when they emerge. The experience taught me that preparation matters, that recording rides and maintaining situational awareness and knowing who to contact in emergencies can mean the difference between victimization and safety. It also taught me that skills you develop for personal reasons, like maintaining Spanish fluency for family connection, sometimes become survival tools in unexpected circumstances. You can't predict what knowledge will save you, which makes the argument for broad learning and cultural connection all the more compelling. Every skill you develop, every language you speak, every relationship you maintain becomes part of your toolkit for navigating an unpredictable world. Today, I work as a security consultant advising companies on protecting customers from insider threats. The Luis case gave me expertise I never wanted, but that qualified me for meaningful work preventing similar crimes. I help rideshare companies and delivery services and other gig economy platforms identify vulnerabilities criminals might exploit. I review monitoring systems, assess background check procedures, recommend red flags that should trigger security reviews. The work feels like turning trauma into purpose, using what I learned from being targeted to protect others from similar threats. My mother says this is exactly the kind of transformation she'd hoped for, taking something terrible and making it meaningful. I'm not sure I'd describe it quite so optimistically. What happened with Luis still feels fundamentally unfair and wrong, but if it had to happen, I'm glad I can extract some purpose from it, can help prevent others from experiencing the same violation and fear. Sometimes understanding what people think you don't understand gives you power they never intended you to have. And sometimes that power, wielded carefully and with purpose, makes all the difference. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.